After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First the chill, then the stupor, then the letting go. Emily Dickinson wrote that in 1862, a year after the outbreak of the Civil War. Like us, she saw her country torn apart by violence and vilification of the other. She could not possibly have imagined that 156 years later, we would be experiencing our own hour of lead. But this week has been perhaps the darkest in a deeply darkening year. We all know the litany: murdered journalists, the Supreme Court's sharp right-hand turn, the Muslim ban, and the reason we're all gathered here today, the ripping apart of families at the border of a nation that up until now has been a safe harbor for the world's oppressed and persecuted, and now we are the persecutors. But we all know this, and that's why we're here. Our job is to make others understand it. So let's talk about this resistance that we're part of. It's a great word, an empowering word. But before we can resist all the hate spewing out of Trump's Washington, we have to resist in ourselves the temptation to give in to despair. It's hard to keep forcing ourselves to read the news. Each new atrocity feels overwhelming. But it's important to acknowledge it, to name it. Because despair and outrage are the only sane responses to what's going on in our democracy. These feelings are not actually particularly new. Like many of you, I remember when JFK was assassinated. I remember seeing my teacher cry, and then my mother and my older sister cry when they picked me up, and I was frightened and confused. But as we drove home and I saw men and women crumpling on the sidewalk, I thought the world was coming to an end. And it didn't. And then we lived through the assassinations of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and then years later, 9/11. And every time it felt like what Chris Murphy said this week about the separation of the border, a gut punch. But we carried on, we marched, we boycotted. And that's why we're here again today. There are people here so young that this is the first real trauma their nation has experienced. And I am so glad and proud of you for being here. Somehow, this moment feels different from all of that. Those were the acts of individual madmen. But even if you believe that Oswald didn't act alone, we knew that a third of the country had not murdered JFK. Now the madmen are among us. They are eating at the marrow of our democracy, and it's up to all of us to rid our body politic of the misogyny, the hatred, the xenophobia that has turned away these families. When I was a 20-year-old newspaper reporter, I spent some time in South Korea. And at one point, the government said to me, you have to either leave immediately or stay for another year or two. I chose to leave, but in order to afford a very sudden overnight flight home, I agreed to be part of an escort team that was taking children to America to be adopted. These were babies voluntarily surrendered by their parents who were afflicted with leprosy. And rather than raise kids on a leper colony, they sent them to America to be adopted, and it was my job to take them on this 18-hour flight. One of the other people on the team was